Many people thought that C-19 was over and things are going back to normal after the onset of the craziness in 2020. Well, it turns out there's this new strain. It's called EG 5.1 or Eris. Now we're going to change the name of C-19. So from now on, I'm going to call it fairy dust. You know how YouTube is. Now it's interesting that they're calling this variant Eris because in Greek mythology, Eris was the Greek goddess of strife and discord. So it's odd that all the names they could give this thing, they name it strife and discord. It's as if they're sending out this type of energy to the masses. Interesting. Now, this strain is spreading rapidly in the UK and the US, especially in the US, and supposedly it spreads faster than the Omicron, or as Black people like to say, the Omarion. Now, the CDC says that the EG5 is behind 17% of these new fairy dust cases. Hospitalizations are on the rise, and Eris is expected to lead the way. Now, you should take precautions and maybe carry some sanitizer and a mask if you feel it's necessary. There may be a new shot in the arm in the works to combat the spread of this new fairy dust. Now, some of the symptoms of this fairy dust include runny nose, headache, fatigue, sore throat, and sneezing. Let's go back to 2020, 2021. Remember when African Americans were told they needed to go out and get the shot in the arm, or let's just say they were told to play in the sandbox so they could avoid getting the fairy dust. I'm speaking in code, but remember when Black people were told to get something put in their arm to prevent getting this thing. African Americans were then told they had the highest rate of COVID and were dying at a faster rate. And we would see white nurses and doctors who worked in predominantly Black neighborhoods on social media saying things like there were a lot of Black people in the hospital with COVID. Well, if you work in a predominantly Black neighborhood, that's probably the demographic you're going to see. Constantly throughout 2020, we were told that African Americans are more likely to get the fairy dust from the other races and perish. Now, this is from the Pfizer website. African Americans are experiencing 2.6 times higher cases, 4.7 times higher hospitalization rates, and 2.1 times more death from the fairy dust compared to their white counterparts, the CDC said. So they're quoting the CDC. Now, the Brookings Institute said that death rates among Black people between ages 55 through 64 are higher than for white people aged 65 through 74, and death rates for Black people aged 65 through 74 were higher than white people aged 75 through 84, and so on. So in every age category, Black people were dying from COVID at roughly the same rate as white people who were more than a decade older. And the Mayo Clinic said that non-Hispanic, Black, or African American people and Hispanic people are about twice as likely to need to stay in the hospital due to fairy dust than non-Hispanic whites. Now, if Black people need to stay in the hospital longer, that would mean that they're likely doing worse and not healing as fast or as effectively as white people. So Black people were constantly told these things around 2020 and 2021. You are sicker. You need to go and play in the sandbox so that you can get better. Then go back and get more sand over and over. So some people have been in the sandbox like 3 or 4 times. Now, the CDC said this in 2022. The CDC said, last year, the report shows that from 2020 to 2021, remember, this was a time frame that Black people were actually told that we were dying at a faster rate than everybody else. In 2021, CDC comes out and says this. 2022, they come out and say this. Differences in COVID-19 death rates decreased among most racial and ethnic groups. This report found disparities in the age-adjusted fairy dust death rates decreased by 14% through 40% for most racial and ethnic groups, including non-Hispanic white people who accounted for 60 to 65% of all people who died. So what they do is they just give you a whole bunch of jargon and make it confusing so you don't understand. But what they're basically saying is, we lied. We told you in 2020 and 2021 that African Americans were the people who were dying at a faster rate from this fairy dust than all the other races. Well, we lied. The real people who were dying are white people. As a matter of fact, 60 to 65% of all the people who died from this fairy dust were white. So that's ironic because nearly every news channel in 2020 and 2021 told Black people you have a higher chance of dying when that was not the case at all. Now, these statistics like this that give you the truth, they're like a needle in a haystack. You got to really kind of dig for them because all the other statistics are opposing. Now, the same thing was happening in Europe. More than 450,000 excess deaths occurred in the EU between March and November of 2020 compared with the same period in the years 2016 through 2019. And this is the data from Eurostat. So almost 500,000 people in Europe died from March to November of 2020. Now, these countries in Europe are predominantly Caucasian or white. Now, in Europe, they were honest about who was dying and how often, but they were not honest in America. They wanted to make it seem like a certain group of people were the primary people dying, when in fact they were not. So why would you say that African Americans are the primary ones dying when white Americans made up more than half of those who died of COVID in 2020 and 2021? Why were they creating fear in African Americans? What do they want you to do, African Americans? Do they want you to go and play in the sandbox like everybody else, if you know what I mean? That's precisely what I think they wanted you to do. And then they appeared confused when you were not going out and playing in that sandbox. You were acting like you didn't trust the toys in the sandbox. They had put out this information to scare you so that you would go play, but many of you refused, and it actually backfired. Data from the U.S. shows that cases and deaths have remained relatively low through the second half of 2022, but about 81% of Americans played in the sandbox at least once as of February 23rd, 2023. So at least 81% of Americans were in that sandbox at least one time, while only 17% of people aged 5 years old or older played in the sandbox more than once. So Asian and non-Hispanic white adults had the highest doses. Well, they played in the sandbox more than anybody. And then after them was Hispanics, and then it was African Americans, and then it was Native Hawaiian or other Pacific Islander groups. So when they said that African Americans were dying at a faster rate, I'm going to be honest, I didn't believe it. And the reason I didn't believe it is because they were barely dying in Africa. The African Americans share an average of 75% to 85% DNA with Africans. So if Africans seem to have a natural resistance and we share most of our DNA with them, wouldn't we have a much lower chance of being unalived from this thing? Wouldn't we have some type of natural immunity? So Melinda Gates, the wife of Microsoft founder Bill Gates, she expressed deep concerns on the damage being caused by the fairy dust. And so she sent out a warning that the fairy dust could leave a high number of deaths in Africa. Let me put a picture of her up for you. Oh, my bad. Okay, there we go. It's going to be horrible in the developing world, she said. Part of the reasons you were seeing the case numbers still do not look very bad is because they don't have access to many tests. Look at what is happening in Ecuador, she says. They are putting bodies out on the streets. You are going to see that in countries in Africa. When I saw what China had to do to isolate the enormous part of its population, she said, my first thought was Africa. How in the world are they going to deal with this? I've been in townships all over Africa and slums. When we talk about physical distancing and hand washing, if you live in slums, you can't physically distance. You have to go out and get your meals. You don't have clean water to wash your hands. So these people are speaking this stuff over you. You have to rebuke this stuff, cast it down, do not accept this stuff or come into agreement with it. Now, her husband, Bill Gates, let me put a picture of him up here. This computer is acting up. Okay, here we go. A co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the BMGF ABC, says the world still does not have enough data to understand why the fairy dust numbers have not been as high as predicted in Africa. Let me give you a translation. This is what he was saying. We wanted the numbers to be higher in Africa, and they weren't, so we just don't know what we did wrong. Now, the American philanthropist, Bill Gates, who invests heavily in healthcare in Africa, says he is, however, happy to have been wrong about the fairy dust rates in Africa. As my grandmother would say, bless his heart. Now, one thing I'm happy to have been wrong about, he says, at least I hope I was wrong, It's my fear that that fairy dust would run rampant in low-income countries. He wrote this in the end of the year note. So far, he says, this hasn't been true. In most of sub-Saharan Africa, for example, case rates and death rates remain much lower than in the US or Europe and on par with New Zealand, which has received so much attention for its handling of the fairy dust. The hardest hit country on the continent of Africa is South Africa. But even there, the case rate is 40% lower than in the United States, and the death rate is nearly 50% lower than in the United States. So according to Gates, more than 1.6 million people have died from the fairy dust pandemic, with more than 75 million cases and tens of trillions of dollars in economic damages. The U.S., he says, has been hit the hardest in the world. That is interesting. So let me get this straight. Africans were not dying of COVID the way that Americans and Europeans were. They weren't even getting it at nearly the rate that people in the UK and US, especially the US, were getting it. Now, if African Americans share so much DNA with Africans, wouldn't we also have some sort of immunity? Why would we be getting it at a faster rate than everyone else? Well, one could argue that African Americans have high blood pressure and a high percentage of diabetes, which could affect their immunity rates, right? The way that they can fight off these fairy dust issues, right? High blood pressure, diabetes. Okay, well, let's see. The World Health Organization estimates that the prevalence of hypertension is highest in the African region, with about 46% of adults aged 25 years and older being hypertensive compared to 35% in the Americas and other HIC and 40% elsewhere in the world. So, according to the National Institute of Health, high blood pressure is also an issue in Africa. So that can't be the reason African Americans would get the fairy dust faster than the other races. Well, could it be diabetes, since African Americans have a higher percentage of diabetes? Let's see. According to the World Health Organization, in the African region, premature death from diabetes, defined as deaths occurring before the age of 70, stands at 58% higher than the global average of 48%. So this is confusing because these statistics are telling me that Africans are not getting COVID. They're not getting the fairy dust, right? Africans are not getting it. They have some type of immunity against it. African Americans share a good 75 to 85% of the DNA that Africans have, yet we're getting it. If you want to say, well, African Americans have higher rates of diabetes, I've just shown you that Africans do too. If you want to say that African Americans have higher blood pressures, I just showed you that Africans do too. So, but the statistics are telling us that African Americans are dying of this at a faster rate. But then they come out and say in 2022, we realize that white Americans are actually dying at a faster rate. We lied. Now, this is confusing, right? Because according to doctors at the Mayo Clinic, type 1 and type 2 diabetes can increase your risk of serious fairy dust symptoms. So having a higher body mass index that's considered overweight, you're obese, you're severely obese, it all increases your risk. Diabetes and obesity both reduce how well a person's immune system works. Diabetes increases the risk of infections in general. So you're telling me that diabetes and high blood pressure are common among Africans, right? Isn't that what the statistics are saying? So how is it that the Africans weren't really getting the fairy dust or dying from it despite their ailments? Wouldn't they be at a more increase? They would be, a higher rate of dying from the fairy dust because of the ailments, because of the high blood pressure and diabetes, but they were not. So are these statistics accurate? Are we really the sickest people on the planet with the weakest immune systems, despite the fact that everyone gets the fairy dust faster than we do, when they're supposedly stronger and healthier than we are? Now, if they lied about the fairy dust in 2020 and 2021, telling you that African Americans had a higher percentage of getting it and were losing their lives due to it, how likely are they to continue telling you lies and saying that we are the sickest people? It's like they're speaking death on us, getting us to agree to being diabetic, to being sick, to having high blood pressure, to having weak immune systems, to being frail and weak, despite the fact that our bodies are saying something different because they're fighting off the fairy dust like the Black Panthers. So here we are, 2023, and we have a new variant of this fairy dust being sprinkled about. Let me go ahead and use my spidey senses, CDC. I'm guessing African Americans will have more of this one too, and they'll be 6 feet under more often than everybody else. Just like in 2020 and 2021, despite the fact that the initial statistics were wrong, they were not true, they were lies. So, African Americans, beware. Don't run around here playing in their sandbox because you're scared of getting fairy dust. You don't know how playing in that sandbox could affect you long term. It could be worse than the fairy dust. None of the statistics they have for African Americans are ever favorable. In every statistic, we are the sickest, the most uneducated, the lowest IQ, the most undesirable, blah, blah, blah. The list goes on. Who's conducting these statistics? The same people who lied to us. So we caught them in a lie, telling us in 2020 and 2021 that we're dying faster than everybody else. Now, if they lied about that, what else are they lying about? Don't trust these statistics that come out telling you that your body's inferior, you're not as pretty, you're not as special. Don't believe these people. Throughout history, we have caught them in too many lies. If you know that Omarion's cousin is out here sending people to the hospital, you need to treat your body like kings and queens. Go to the gym, eat healthier foods, get you some herbs for your body, check to make sure your hormones are balanced, get you some vitamin D, go out in the sun, walk barefoot on the earth, practice self-care, stay around positive people. All right? Thank you for watching. And I want you to check out my online bookstore before you guys go, www.burksbooks.com. And I will see you in the next video. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.